Welcome to another episode of the Your Longevity Blueprint podcast. Today, my guest is Brian Karr, who's a second-generation indoor environmental consultant who specializes in working with hypersensitive individuals with complex chronic medical conditions. He helps individuals with families to understand if mold, mycotoxins, or other indoor pathogens exist in their home that may be contributing to their health conditions and how to remedy those issues. Brian has become a mold and biotoxin expert to many medical practitioners across the country and has helped over 5,000 hypersensitive individuals worldwide to create healthier living environments that have allowed their doctors to help them get better. Brian is a co-founder of We Inspect, the host of Mold Finders Radio, and an expert at identifying indicators of mold growth, including, but not limited to, strategic sampling, validating, and developing remedial strategies for mold growth and biotoxin production in all areas of a home or building, including walls, floors, ceilings, crawl spaces, basement, attics, and HVAC systems. That's a lot.
I have to edit that down for you next time, or for even I'm listening, like, oh my goodness.
Well, it sounds cool. It sounds like there's a lot we have to talk about. So, welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you for having me and dealing with that introductory bio.
Well, as many of my guests have, it sounds like you also have a story. So tell me the story behind you and just why you became such an expert in mold. How has this become your passion and your area of expertise?
Yeah, I'll tell you, people don't usually grow up wanting to do this. This isn't a thing. It's not like being a fireman or a professional athlete or whatever. It's usually everybody that's in this world has had something happen to them or somebody that they love or whatever it is. And it just sort of like opens your eyes and you're like, what have I been doing my whole life? Like, and not in a way where it's like, oh, this is such an amazing opportunity, but in a way like the impact I can have here is like a real impact. Like I can actually like do something to help some people here, as opposed to working in an office, doing this, doing that, which is, previous life. Right. And so for me, I lived in an apartment in West Hollywood. All those buildings are like 30s to 50s is when they were built, right? So they're all old buildings. And I'll shorten it, but basically I had a leak. I explained it, everybody can visualize.
Don't leave
it.
out the good parts.
Yeah. I had a leak that came down on from the ceiling. There's a pipe running through my ceiling that was to the bathroom that was above me. So I was sitting on my bed. It was 2008. I actually had been laid off because that was right around where the recession happened. And so a lot of companies were constricting at that point. And so I was on my bed looking for a job on monster.com. That's what's so funny about this whole story, is that it started with me looking for a job. And at the end, it like found me, not even like just a job, but like an entire like new life, which is very interesting, like full circle. But I'm like looking and I'm typing, and I feel like something on my hand, and it ends up being a water drip. And I look up at the ceiling and it's like, I'm seeing the stain. Like it was so much water
that you'd never seen before.
Time.
Like you.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was like water's dripping. I see a stain. The stain starts growing. The ceiling starts like kind of bubbling down. I mean, it was like fast because there was so much water. Dove out of my bed. Water comes down on my bed. It's a whole thing. So I call.
That sounds bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I call the landlord. I'm like, hey, there's this leak, and they get it stopped. They stop the leak. They turn off the water main or whatever, and then they come in and they dry out the ceiling area where the water was. And they basically say, all right, you're good. Right. We dried it. All good. And, I didn't know any better. What do I know? Just like most people.
Sounds good. Sounds like they're doing the right thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I, over the next like 2 months, I start getting symptoms that start coming that I never had before. The two big ones were neurological stuff like forgetfulness. I'm usually really sharp. I wasn't as sharp. Like I noticed it. It's kind of hard to like really put into words what that means, but you just kind of feel like when you're not on.
Yeah. Yep.
So I was starting to feel like that. And my girlfriend who I was dating, who's now my wife, her dad ended up being my mentor and who kind of taught me all this stuff, right? And so I hadn't met him yet. And she's like, what you're saying sounds like a lot of what my dad's clients say are happening to them, right?
Oh, aren't you lucky that you had her in your life?
Honestly, I say this to this day. If it wasn't, I mean, there's a million reasons why I'm lucky that she's in my life, but this part specifically, my health, my individual health specifically, if it wasn't for her, who knows where I would be at this point in terms of what my health looks like, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's crazy to think back like that. So I was having some of the neuro stuff, and then I wake up one morning and I go to wash my face, and my face had like broken out like eczema, like all over my face. And like that was the trigger, not my brain not working. Apparently that wasn't important enough, but me like the
When you didn't
vanity
look
of
so
my
good, yeah.
yeah, the vanity of my face not looking good was apparently the thing that kicked me into gear. And so finally I'm like, wow, maybe this is what that is. So I call the landlords. I'm like, hey, I think there's a mold problem here. And so what do? They send in their inspector. They come in, they take an air sample in the room for 5 minutes, they leave. And in 24 hours, I get a clean bill of health for my house. Your house is fine. It must be you. Okay, cool. So then I end up having her dad come in, and his name is Mark, and he's now my father-in-law. And I have him come in, and he spends 2 hours in my 800 square foot apartment. He, in my room, finds out there's no water damage or staining on any of my walls anywhere, right? And this is like one of the biggest things that happens with this whole mold thing with people.
So visually, there were no clues, obvious clues. Yeah.
Yeah, outside of the fact that there was a stain on the ceiling, but that was dry and it was fine. But on the walls, everything's fine, right? And you know, visually, to your point, or what you said. And so come to find out that I think about it now and it makes there's so much water. But if you, like everybody listening, imagine you pour a glass of water on a table or on your kitchen island. What direction does it go? It goes sideways.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And then what happens when the water hits the end of the island?
Falls off.
It goes down.
Yeah.
That's what happened in my ceiling. It went sideways and it got to my walls and it went down. Except it went down all 4 of my walls because there was so much water. And I was basically sleeping in a toxic box and for months. And that's why all this stuff started happening so fast, because it was such an acute hit for me, right? And so anyway, that was kind of my view on what happened. And what at the end of it, he finds these things. He finds other stuff in my apartment, by the way, too, which is a whole other thing. But there ended up being 8 problems in my entire apartment. 4 of them were each wall within my room that I was literally surrounded in. And at the end, he asked me this question. I don't even know if he remembers if he asked or not. I mean, I've told the story enough, so he probably either remembers or
he's been reminded. Yeah.
Yeah, he's been reminded. He's like, well, what do you want to do? I was like, what do you mean, what do I want to do? He's like, well, do you want to stay in this place? Do you want to leave? Like, what do you want to do? We know it's a problem.
Should I stay or should I go? Yeah.
Right. And I was like, well, I don't want to stay here. It's been a whole issue, even getting them to believe there's a problem and this and that. So like, I mean, I want to go, but I just like renewed my lease 3 months ago and I'm in this lease. And he's like, that doesn't mean anything. He's like, contracts are meant to be broken. Contracts are only binding if the people who wrote them want them to be binding. If they change their mind, then the contract doesn't mean anything anymore. And that's that. So basically, he then helps me create a story present, you know, however you want to say it, where I go back to the landlord and it's like, listen, these are your options, either this or this. And man, they let me out of that thing so fast. And I think a lot of people feel so trapped in like lease agreements and these contracts and stuff. Yeah. When the reality is if it's more difficult for them to keep you in under this contract, they'd rather just let you out and bring somebody in, right? Anyway, so we go through this whole thing, and at the end of it, I'm like, all right, I saw what the normal kind of local inspector does. They come in, air sample, in, out, everything's fine. And if that's what I relied on, like we said, who knows where I'd be now. Or I see like how it's really done and how big of an impact it had on me, right? And so again, fast or rewind, I was on my bed looking for a job. And I literally was typing like, because I didn't even know where to look. I'm like, job that will make me feel fulfilled. What pops up? And like nothing pops up, right? And then this comes up and I just like immediately was like, I want to work for you. I want to do this. This is really cool.
So was he some like environmental specialist? Like what was his title? Or
he does what we do. We call ourselves indoor environmental consultants.
Okay.
But we specialize in understanding mold, water damage, biotoxins, how they move through houses, how it impacts people, like all that, so that whole thing. That's why his client base was very much like, oh, my dad says a lot of his clients have neurological this and this, that, and this, that, because he had he knew how to do this process. And when the doctors and the practitioners and the functional medicine health coaches and all of them find someone who actually knows how to find the problems in a house, they send all of their patients and everyone to them because they need the help. And so that's sort of what he had started creating already. And so that was it. So I was, at that point,
You're hooked. You're like, this is what I'm doing. Yeah.
you tell your girlfriend you've been dating for 3 months, you want to work for her dad. You're like all in on the relationship.
Like, even if you don't want to marry me, I'm gonna work with your dad.
So yeah, that's the story. That's how it all happened. And I just like kind of fell in love with the I don't know.
Sounds like the ability to make a
challenge
difference.
of it.
Yeah.
The game of it, kind of like everything is different, but the reward of it being that I didn't just
great.
go into work and hit a KPI. Like I actually helped someone. And within a month after I was, kind of through all my training with them, somebody told me I saved their lives. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And that's a high you don't get off of anything else, is when someone tells you something like that. So that's why I'm here.
Totally agreed. Now I'm curious all the other problems that happened in your apartment. And maybe at the end we'll come back to some issues other than mold. Obviously, the majority of this episode today will focus on that. And I have not a similar story, but I did have a moment. We had a land hurricane in Iowa. I'm from Iowa here. A lot of my listeners are. Which, I mean, really impacted the roofs of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of houses. And I was playing with cards on the table in the basement with my, I don't know how old he was, a 1.5, 2-year-old at the time. And the cards were wet. And I'm like, why would these cards be wet? And I'm like, I look up and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, we knew our roof had been impacted, but it was just, one of those, we had to get lots of remediation. And that's a whole story too. But it's that moment where you're like, this is not happening to me right now.
I know. In the moment, it's very like, what do I do first?
Yes.
And the first thing is just stop the water as fast as you can. That's the first thing. Like, forget about the rest of it. Just stop it from continuing. And then you kind of get in the rest of it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm going to go back to some of those symptoms. So, and for my listeners, my average patient population, they're coming in with a slew of vague symptoms. We do a lot with optimizing hormones here, but aside from that, I have patients fill out a big 2-page questionnaire to see if their environment really could be contributing to the way they feel. And so, mold specifically, and toxins from mold, mycotoxins, which we'll talk a little bit about today, can cause a slew of symptoms in various organ systems. So for the listeners, I just want to preface this at the beginning before, we get into the blunt of this episode. So it's not just respiratory irritation or sinusitis or coughing, right? Mold toxins can affect the brain, like you were saying, causing brain fog, affecting your mood, causing migraines, fatigue, disequilibrium, or that's how I've been impacted, just feeling like I'm off balance, like something's not quite right. It can cause cardiac symptoms like palpitations, can impact your vision, can cause easy bruising, swelling, frequent illnesses, can affect your sleep, your bowels, cause rashes, or you were saying some dermatologic issues. Yeah. Back to the nervous system, can cause tingling. When I hear weird symptoms from patients in the absence of any trauma or injury, I'm always thinking, is there a toxin, something else that's impacting the nervous system? Can lead to allergies, POTS, and I've shared some of my story on the show before. Histamine issues, food sensitivities, even fatty liver, cancers, weird things like interstitial cystitis. And I mean, gosh, I could go on. And I'll post the link to Jill Krista's questionnaire in the show notes later. But, ultimately, if patients flag high on this questionnaire, we're running biotoxin labs, urine mycotoxin testing, right? And if labs are positive, while I can help treat the patient, the number one most important step is removing them from the source of exposure. And that is not my area of expertise. And so that's why I brought you on the show today, right? I can give patients pills, potions, powders, medications, whatnot, and I can optimize their hormones. But if they're in a toxic environment, there's going to be a limit to how well they can get. So I want to talk a lot about the environment today. So let's kind of dive into that. And maybe I'll just ask, like, in your opinion, what's the best way to test a home for mold? So if a patient's provider like myself is saying, I'm pretty sure you're moldy, your labs look moldy, your symptoms suggest that, right? And obviously their home is where they spend a lot of time. How can they confirm that? So let's go into like testing, in your opinion.
Yeah. And real quick before that, I just want to say, because I've just seen it happen so many times. if you're working with a doctor or a health coach or a practitioner and you trust them, you vetted them, and they're not your traditional MD and they're actually trying to figure out what's going on, and they tell you what you just said, there's some sort of mold issue going on here, please, please, please believe them. Because our initial, and I've just seen it so many times, the initial response is like this
Denial. Yeah.
It is, it's denial. And I think it's because I have a couple reasons why I think it is. One, I think the thought of even trying to figure it out is overwhelming. So it's much easier to just try to like let it be anything else but this thing, right? The other thing is that it's going away now a little bit, but it's still there. There's this stigma tied to mold, right? And you're like, oh, I have mold in my house. I don't take care of my house. It's my fault. I'm dirty. It has nothing to do with you. 9 out of 10 houses that I walk into, maybe even more, I will find mold in them, right? It has nothing to do with you, right? So
yeah,
just try to be open-minded to it. Like when you have that conversation, with the listener that's listening to this or their equivalent of that it's way more normal than you think. I think
it's not a personal insult. Yeah, exactly. It's not a, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good point.
So in terms of testing, so there's a lot of different types of tests you can do, and they all have different purposes and goals. So if we're at the stage now where your doctor comes to you and they're like, hey, I'm seeing signs of mold exposure here. So here's what we need to do. We need to figure out if it's where you're currently living or if you were exposed to it previously and you've built up a toxic load in here that we just need to detox out, right? We got to figure these two things out. So if it's all about just validation, big picture, do I have a problem, right? Not where is the problem? How do I fix the problem? How widespread is the problem? None of that. Just, do I have a problem? And sort of how does it rank in the grand scheme of things? Then the best way to do that is through dust testing. And so a lot of times, and so I even said it in my situation, I thought I had a problem. They sent somebody in, they did an air sample, and it makes a lot of sense because you're like, well, I'm breathing the air, so like I'll just test the air. Like logically, this kind of makes sense, right?
And in Iowa, 95, okay, probably 100% of all inspectors, is that what I would call them? Yeah, versus remediators. Inspectors do air testing. And I tell my patients, I mean, sometimes it's a hard sell, for myself, who I'm not an inspector, to tell the patient, no, air testing is missing the problem. So yes, please spend time here and differentiate air testing and its limitations from dust testing.
I will. And then secondarily, the different types there is a type of air testing that is great that we do all the time. The type you shouldn't do. So when we talk, it's very easy to like blanket statement air testing sucks, but there is actually portions when you do it. It's just when and how you do it.
I'm pretty sure what people do here sucks.
Well, yeah, what most people do and how they use air tests is not really the way to use it. So if the use case is, I want to see if I have a mold problem, so I'm going to do some sort of air quality testing and see what I'm breathing. While it sounds contradictory, air testing is not the way to do it. Now, a couple reasons why. Number one, if you're putting an air sample pump, which is your air test, there's a pump that collects air. So basically what happens, you have this kind of device you stick up, you put a little circular kind of tube or canister sort of thing on the top of it. Inside of it, there's a glass slide, which is the types of slides like when we were in school that you would stick under a microscope in science class, right? And then when you turn the pump on, it sucks air into that little canister, and then whatever's on the canister or whatever air is in the air will sit on that slide. They take the slide out, and that's how they analyze it. So that's how it works.
So they're counting spores that are landing on that slide? Or
they're counting spores that are landing on the slide.
Okay.
So the thing is, the air movement in a space is constantly changing. So what you're really doing is trying to take like a photograph of a kid that's running. That's what you're trying to do. And so
yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, like imagine like you're trying to do that and like they either run past the frame and you miss them, or maybe you get them but they're blurry and they just like whatever it is. It's a snapshot in time what you're doing at that point. And so whatever happens to be floating around might get pulled into that thing. It might not get pulled into that thing, right?
What's the distance that like air testing, is it 4, 8, like how many feet is air testing really reflective of? Or is that a fair question?
It's a completely fair question. And my argument would be is that we shouldn't look at it like that. So it shouldn't be like how much space can an air test cover. It should be how close can I get my air sample to where I think the problem is and
Sure.
collect
Okay.
it
Yeah,
from
that's a
there.
better question. Yeah. Okay.
And so that's kind of the way that we do use them, which I could go into in a minute. So that's one reason, right? The other reason is, and this gets more into sort of the science of like what we're actually breathing when we're exposed to a mold issue. Okay. A lot of us hear the word mold spore. We think spores, that's all that exists on a mold colony. It's the spores, that's what the problem is. There's actually a very small fraction of what we're breathing. And so if we're using a sample that can only identify that, we're missing like 95% of what we're being exposed to on top of it. So that's the second part of it. And so what I mean by that is there's a lot of research out there and kind of talks about this. You have spores and you have fragments that break off of colonies. So here's the image for everybody to think about. Think about a tree outside, right? So a tree has leaves. Let's say the leaves are the equivalent of a mold spore, right? Fall comes, leaves fall off the tree. That's the equivalent of spores coming off your colony, right? Well, you still have this gigantic tree that's sitting there, right? Branches, trunk, roots, bark, all this stuff that's on this tree. This is all part of the tree, okay? This is all part of the structure. Now, when a mold colony has water currently, which most problems in houses are not currently wet. This is the other big thing which we could get into. Most mold problems in homes, in terms of exposure that's happening, are in areas that got wet previously that have been dry for sometimes years. And what happens is the mold grows like a flower, right? Water flower, flower grows. When you stop watering the flower doesn't like take its roots out of the ground and go try to find another vase with water in it, right? Like that's not what it does. It dries out. It starts to wilt over. It becomes brittle. If you go touch it after a while, it'll kind of like break into tiny pieces in your hands, right? That's what happens to mold colonies. So if we know that the majority of problems in homes are not in areas that have an active water issue right now, but are in areas where my dishwasher leaked last year and it got under my cabinetry and we just dried it with a fan, but mold grew. Well, it's not going to be dry right now. So what happens is the colony becomes very brittle and fragile, like that dry flower that you like hang upside down on the wall to save, right? If you're going to save it. So you go back to the image of the tree, the branches, the roots, the trunk, all that stuff. Now imagine if a gust of wind came by and shattered that entire tree into a trillion tiny little pieces. The pieces would be way smaller than the size of the leaves because of how it would break and shatter apart. That's what happens with colonies. And so when we breathe this stuff in the house, we're breathing all of that. We're not just breathing the leaves. We're breathing all the stuff that broke apart into teeny tiny fragments, and that's what we breathe. And the problem with it is that our bodies, while we do have natural filtration built into our bodies to protect our lungs specifically, right? So our nose and our throat tries to filter stuff out. These fragments are so small, they just go right through all of it. Like the net isn't tight enough to keep them from going through. So they just fly straight through. And so a lot of what triggers the immune response and a lot of what's going on is actually the fragments that break off of colonies more than mold. And so now the science research that ties to this is the fragments that break off of a colony can be up to 500 times the amount of spores that come off of that same colony.
When you say fragments, though, also, are you alluding to like mycotoxins, bacteria, other things?
So the mycotoxins can be on the fragments,
okay,
which I could explain in a second to give a
yeah,
visual on what happens. But really, it's the idea of like that flower that's hanging on the wall, and if I crushed it, every teeny tiny little piece. There's actually, this happened to me. I bought my wife all these, but when I was dating her, I bought her all these flowers. That's why I keep going to this analogy. And when I was trying to get her to like me, and then finally I felt like I won. But she had all these
and then
flowers.
she tells you she doesn't like flowers. No, I'm just kidding.
Of course, right? Well, no, that didn't happen, luckily. But she would hang all the flowers upside down on the wall. That's how, because she wanted to save all of them, right? Well, one day I went over there. I was like, all right, I'm going to take all these off now. There's like literally like 15 of these dead things sitting on the wall over. Why? Because we took them out of the water and hung them, right? All that stuff. So she lived in we lived in California, so she lived in a kind of near a beach town. And so there's no air conditioning in those like apartments in those places. So what you do is you open your door and you put an oscillating fan by the door, and that's how you get airflow coming in. That's how you do it. So I go to grab the flowers, and right when I grab them, I don't think that they're just going to shatter into a million pieces in my hands like they did. And I grabbed them, and right when I did it, the fan sort of like the oscillating fan sort of hit me right at the same time, and it blew
Oof.
all of these little pieces all over her room, into the carpet fibers, all over her little vanity, which was right near it, and like to her bedding and stuff. And some of it I could get out, but there was so much in the carpet fibers, like you couldn't even get it out. That's how small they were, and that's how many there were, right? And this is what happens with a mole colony that dries, and then an air current comes and shatters it apart, right? So you take all of this information now and you tie it back to, I'm going to do an air sample in the middle of the room. Limitation one, it's only going to pull in what happens to be floating around right now. Limitation two, it can't even account for 500 times of the fragments that are floating around that I need to be evaluating anyways. And then the third part of why air samples in that manner don't work is because the further away you get from source, the exponentially less effective they become. So for a year, I wanted to prove this, like formally prove it. I knew it just because I've done it for so long, but like I wanted to have something I could look at. So for a year, every house that I went into, if I thought that there was mold in a wall, hidden behind a wall, right? So let's say I saw a sign of hidden mold, which we could talk about. I was like, cool, I'm gonna test this wall where I think it actually is. And I tested it with what's called a source air sample, right? A cavity test that I did in this wall. I would do that. And then I would walk literally like 3 feet away and put an air sample pump up in the way that most of the local inspectors do it. And I ran a sample there at the same time I ran this one. 78% of the time when there was a problem in the wall, 3 feet away, the air sample that I took said there was no problem.
I totally believe it, but that just blows my mind because you would think that technology, I don't know, and education has advanced to the point where like this would have been figured out. It's just frustrating.
You know, it's interesting. We have a lot of technology. It's just how you use it, right? Like if you use something, like if you're a doctor and you're wanting to do a mycotoxin test and you do urine testing for that, but instead you're like, I'm going to pull a blood draw and I'm going to look for mycotoxins here. Oh, you don't have any mycotoxins. I guess you're cool. Like you just used the wrong test. Right? Like you just need to use the right test for the right purpose. And then that's how you like build sampling plans that really show you not only like where source is located, but how it's moving through space, what you're being exposed to, how it's circulating. Like you just use the right test in the right way, and then you can build this incredibly comprehensive picture that shows you exactly everything that's going on, and it puts all the puzzle pieces together, right? And that's really how we look at doing it. So with all I said, this is why air samples don't work. So then what do, right?
Can I interrupt you before you get onto the better? So then in my head, I'm thinking, so how do you take care of all those fragments? Is that where fogging comes in? And cleaning and partially?
It is.
I want to come, either we can go there now or come back to that. So you tell me.
Let's go back to that because that's remediation and we can do a whole thing talking about it.
Okay, sure.
But yeah. So yeah, we'll come back to it.
We'll go to the better test first, stay on testing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so now the better test. Now keep in mind, just to reset, the goal of this test that we're talking about is just to let us know if we're being exposed in the house. That's all that we really want to know right now, right? Dust is the place to get this information. And so there's a couple reasons why. Number one, gravity is going to bring everything down to the surfaces, which means that the dust is actually the best reservoir, just the best collection of information for us to even pull from.
Yeah.
So we get a much better spot to even start extracting information out of, as opposed to air floating around that's moving all the time and it's not really predictive or showing what's happened historically in the house. You can get a feel of what's gone on in a house or an apartment or whatever for a very extended period of time because the history builds up in the dust. It holds all of it. So that's where we want to go to find the information, right? So one reason that dust is great is because it literally just has the information there that we want in the first place. Now, the second thing is that we're able to analyze that information to a much more comprehensive way than you could from air testing. So like I said, air testing, you can only look at spores, right? In dust sampling, you're now able to have that analyzed down to the DNA level, which will then identify the DNA signatures of all those fragments we talked about, which means I could have one spore picked up of Stachybotrys, which is what's known as the black toxic mold, if anyone's ever heard of that, right? But we know from the studies and the research has come out that there could be 500 times that in terms of the amount of fragments that are created off that colony, which means there could be 500 fragments of Stachybotrys floating around or sitting in dust that we could then find, that we could then see, right? And so what the dust does is it gives us the best place to pull information, but it also gives us the best way to analyze it, because you can't analyze air testing and other things in the same method. So what happened is that there's literally PCR. A lot of us know what that is now after COVID happened. We know what that phrase is. So there's PCR, which is essentially just DNA formatting, but then there's mold specific assays that were created, which is here are the strains of mold that we want to see, and they've created DNA sequencing for all of them. So we're now able to see at a DNA level, which accounts for the fragments. Accounting for the fragments now lets us understand what our exposure load is. It's a more accurate understanding of what we're truly breathing and what our body is taking in. So it's giving you not only better information what's going on in the house, but better information of what you're breathing. And then, the question like, well, I'm not breathing the dust. Well, you are. So there's this other concept that's called the personal cloud effect. This is another whole study on building science. If anybody is listening, ever watched Charlie Brown back in the day, there's that dirty kid, Pigpen, that had like that cloud of dirt around him everywhere that he went. You have a cloud just like that following you around every single step you take in your home, every time you sit down, except it's not gross, smelly dirt. It's invisible particle that pops up and resuspends into your breathing zone and around you as you move. So when you sit down, when you bump something, whatever, you're constantly repopping this stuff up.
Makes sense.
And it comes up and gravity brings it down, and then it comes up and gravity brings it down. And so you're constantly creating almost like this wake as you move of all the stuff that's popping up. And that's how you're breathing. That's how you're exposed. So if we're truly trying to understand exposure, we have dust being the place where the best area to get the information is.
Yep.
The place where we're able to analyze it most effectively, and the place that actually shows us what we're breathing on a regular basis. That's what your dust is. And so this now allows us to truly understand what you're being exposed to, how much you're being exposed to. And, do I need to start thinking about going to the next step of figuring out where it's coming from, right? And so that's it's the best screening test that exists, is to be able to do that.
So to date, we had at our clinic had been using the traditional ERMI test, right? And I understand you guys have kind of revamped that. Yep. So explain. So your test is literally called the dust test, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But tell us why your dust test is the best dust test.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how it's similar first, because I think that that's important. When ERMI was created, they created that DNA formatting for the mold types I just talked about. That was created while ERMI was created. Okay, so the EPA did this study. Two things came out of that study. What's funny is that ERMI is actually not a sample. This is like the biggest sort of misconception on what ERMI is. It's now called an ERMI because it's easier to say and nobody really knows what to call it, so they just call it that. But ERMI is an interpretation of data. That's what ERMI is. It's an index. So ERMI,
Environmental Relative Mold Index. Yeah,
there you go. So it's an index that's laid on top of raw data. That's what ERMI actually is. So when you're getting an ERMI, you're not actually saying I'm buying an ERMI sample. What you're buying is a PCR DNA sample of mold. And what you're getting is an ERMI index laid on top of it to try to interpret it. That's what you're getting, okay? So a lot of people think I'm buying an ERMI. Well, kind of. You're actually getting a DNA sample, and then you're getting an interpretation, and that's what the ERMI piece is. So the raw data is the best, like I just said, like for all the reasons I just said, right? So we didn't recreate that wheel. Like, use that, because that's the best that exists. That's what we have. So the comparison point of what's the same is you're looking at the same exact molds, the same exact analysis, the same way. So the raw data is the same. Now, the problem is what that index, what that ERMI is actually doing when it's trying to comprehend or provide context for what it means. Without getting super in it, because people have to have the reports in front of them to really get it. So I want to kind of do it like very top end. But basically what the ERMI does is it separates your molds into two groups. You have group 1 and group 2. It calls group 1 water damage molds. It calls group 2 common indoor molds. First thing, every mold is a water damage mold. So to normalize these other molds that they're not important is completely misleading for people, and it actually causes a lot of issue in how people even interpret this thing. Mold doesn't grow without water, therefore every mold is a water damaged mold. So they're all water damaged molds. So cool, put that on the side. So the other thing is we call it common, and when you call it common, you're now normalizing it and thinking it's okay for it to be here. And without getting into things, but just everybody sit and think for a second, what are things that happen all the time that are common but are not okay that are happening, right? That's also what's being implied here in how they just lay out the test before they're even interpreting anything, right? So just sort of like the vernacular and how they're using and sort of what they're implying to you initially.
So are you saying, is this kind of where, like, if you have a low ERMI score, which implies you don't have a problem, but yet you still have Chaetomium or Aspergillus or something, that's still bad?
Well, this is kind of part of it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is part of that, right? So the way that the ERMI score is calculated, they look at your group 1 molds and they look at your group 2 molds. And again, people don't have this in front of them. So basically they assign a score to each of them.
Mm-hmm.
So for easy math, just so everybody can listen, they're going to say group 1, let's say, is a score of 5. And group 10, or excuse me, group 2 is a score of 10, okay? So let's say you have 5 in your group 1, 10 in your group 2, okay? So you have a 5 and a 10. So the way the math works on ERMI is they subtract group 2 from group 1, which conceptually what they are doing is not only are they saying that these molds are common and you inherently shouldn't even care about them, but what they are also saying in the way that they've created the math on how they're doing the formula is that these molds also make the group 1 molds apparently less impactful. Because the way the math works is they're saying 5, which is your group 1, minus 10, which is your group 2, that equals -5. Right. Your score is -5. So apparently mold plus mold equals less mold in this.
So in this ranking, just to clarify for the audience too, the lower score is supposedly better, right? You don't want to have a really high score. Correct. So you're saying if you're -5, that should be a really great score. But in reality, that doesn't mean that you have a safe environment. Yeah.
100%. And so now think if you just flip the numbers and you just say, okay, now the group 1 is 10 and the group 2 is 5. So now you're subtracting 5 from 10 instead of the other way around. You would have a score of 5 instead of -5, but you would literally have the same amount of mold in the house, right? And so that's the problem, is that when you start looking at an ERMI score, where the math, the functional math behind it literally doesn't make sense. It'd be like if I told my daughter, here's 2 apples on this side of the table and here's 2 apples on this side of the table. How many do you see? And if she told me, I don't see any apples. That is what the equivalent of what this math is. And so what it does is that it gives false sense of security to a lot of people, because they'll have a low ERMI, and there's a lot of this floating around that if I have an ERMI score that's a 2 or less, then my home is fine.
Safe. Yeah.
Live it.
Yeah.
Which is complete BS when you start understanding how the math is done. And so a lot of people are making like huge decisions, huge financial and health decisions off of a math formula that says 2 + 2 is 0. And it's a big, big problem. And so the reason that we started working on the dust test and trying to, and again, it's not creating a sample, it's essentially creating a different type of interpretation and a whole different experience on how you're understanding the information and getting guidance off of it. That's really what the big difference is behind it. Was all based around 3 questions that pretty much everyone has when they're running them. So I personally have taken thousands of phone calls from people like, here's my ERMI, what does it mean? Here's my ERMI, what does it mean? Can you tell me what to do? What do I do? And out of all of that, I sat down and I was like, okay, if I'm going to try to fix how this PCR data is being interpreted, I need to know what the questions are that people are asking and why they're wanting to do it. And then I could try to figure out how to answer that, right? And so I sat down, I went through all this, and here are the 3 things I came up with. They want to know if they have a problem. They want to know how bad it is. And then they want to know what they need to do about it.
Right.
It's the only reason you run a screening test with the purpose of just understanding what's here, is because those are your driving questions driving.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, if these are the questions that people need answered, then I need to figure out how to provide information that's supported by real inspection data that will allow them to make these decisions, right? So I went through the last 3 years of inspections that we did at We Inspect. Because in all of those inspections, we were doing ERMI samples in the house. It's an important piece of the equation. You want to know what's in the dust. But we were also doing a full inspection. I could tell you how many sources we found behind walls and cabinets and ceilings and all the stuff in every single one of those houses. I could tell you if mycotoxins were there or not. I could tell you if endotoxins were there or not. Like, I had the whole picture. So we now have, if I anchored everything to an ERMI result, and I put all the other information in there, I now have enough to start a machine learning process and an algorithm to try to make some sense of what it really means, right? And so when I go back and I start thinking of these questions, do I have a problem? How bad is it? Both of those questions are really rooted in comparison, right? Yes, you have a problem. Okay, well, is it bad? Is it good? Is it a lot? Is it little? Can I move somewhere else? Would it be better? Would it not? How much money should what is so-and-so's down? How does my house compare to everyone else? Because that's going to drive my decision on what I do. So first it was, what are the questions? The second is, how do we give the information in a way that's going to make sense for sort of the sentiment of the question in the first place, like the reason we were asking in the first place and how we interpret it. And it really has to have comparison, because without a comparison point, you still are not able to answer the third question, which is, what do I do? Meaning, do I stay or do I leave? Because if your house, maybe it has problems, but it falls in the lower 25% of houses that we inspected over that 3-year period, which is our sample base that we have, well, then your odds of finding a better house are not good, because you're in the lower 25% of the houses in terms of load of what's going on, right? So we had to add that layer of context on the information. So that's essentially what we did. So we went through and we created a what's it called? Like a percentile sort of scale, right? I got this idea when I had my latest kid. He's 2 now, but when we were putting the dust test together, it was right around this time. And I'd take him in to get his, you go every month and they like measure the size of their head and their body and stuff. And like, oh, they're on this percentile. His head isn't gigantic. It's normal size. You're like, oh, that feels great. It's like, oh, we should portray this information in like a percentile scale like this, so people understand like where their house is. Do you have a gigantic head house or a normal head house? Like, where is it at? And so that was sort of the idea for like, this is how we can display and present information to people where it's easy and it makes sense for ranking, and it will answer both of the two questions at the same time. Do I have a problem? Sure, like yes or no. But like, how bad is it? Lower 25%, upper 9%, the worst 9 or 10%, the lowest 25, like where are you, right? And so that's really what the core of the dust test is. It's the same analysis and the same testing that was, that we know has been good and really is the best that exists, with a different layer of interpretation that was guided and informed by the questions, the thousands of questions that I've been asked over all of the years, to try to give people the information they really need to start moving forward and to make decisions. And then the last piece on it is, we always take those phone calls. We were always taking those phone calls because there were so many questions that came off of it. Not just, the first question is, what does this mean? And then we've kind of hopefully answered that in how we deliver the report. But then there was other questions like, well, I'm renting and I'm thinking this, or I've owned my house, or this, or like, there's all like kind of the personal scenarios and just like the specific things that are going on. And like, if you run a clinical test, you go to your doctor and you ask your doctor, what does this mean for me, right? Not, well, here's your number, here you go, right? We need to close that loop so somebody feels that that they're now understanding what it means specifically for them. So the really important thing that we felt we had to do in this was add on a consult call on the back end of every single dust test that gets run. So it's a free call that comes with it. So here's your information. Now get on your call. Now let's round out and close the loop on this and talk about you individually with this data over here. Say, okay, how do we best move forward, right? And so that's really what the goal was and how we designed it and how we put it together.
No, that's great. Can you also expand on the different levels of the dust test?
Yeah. So there's 3 different versions of the dust test you can get. The first one is called it's just the mold test. Just the first one is the mold test. So this is literally your ERMI equivalent in terms of what you're getting in analysis. Obviously, the overlay is different. The next one is called the toxic mold test. So what this does, this is the other nice thing about the dust test, is that you can add on additional analysis onto your same dust sample. And if you actually went out and tried to do them all separately, you start getting cost savings if you lump it into the dust test in a single analysis versus like, I'm going to go over here and buy this mycotoxin test and then over here and buy this ERMI test. Like, it'll end up costing you more. So the toxic mold test, what it does, same panel of molds, and then it adds on mycotoxin testing. So you can actually test for the mycotoxins which is the chemical created by certain molds, right? These toxic chemicals, you can test for them, which is great if you're trying to put correlation to body and to home. It's really awesome to be able to do that. Most people end up getting that one. That's the one that most people get, because usually people are coming in and there's some sort of toxicity issue that they're either concerned about or they already know about. And so they usually want to see that piece of it. The third one is called the toxic mold and bacteria test. And what this does is it adds on now a third layer of endotoxin analysis, which is a toxin that's created by gram-negative bacteria, which are very common in water-damaged environments. So now you're looking at a larger biotoxin load of toxins created from mold and specific bacteria that are most common when there's water damage issues in homes. And the bacterial endotoxins, they're also referred to, when you're talking about them in the body, they're referred to as LPS.
Lipopolysaccharide. Yeah.
Lipopolysaccharide. I was just saying lollipop. I was like, no, that's not it.
Well, that makes it sound positive, although sugar's not good, but you know.
I know.
This is bad. Right? LPS is bad. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I was even speaking with Dr. Strand over a biosite, and we were talking all gut, and she's like, I actually think that LPS is the biggest issue that's happening in guts and inflammatory issues. She's like, I even think it's bigger than mycotoxin issues. So, you know, certain doctors have different views on it, but the general consensus is that stuff isn't good. And it's a problem, right? And so we're able to do that. And I know a lot of the clinicians are starting to understand LPS load in the body, and they're starting to look at this stuff. So it's another correlation you can make to environment. Because to your point at the top of the episode here was, I could treat you all day, but if you're still being exposed, at some point the treatment's not going to work because the exposure is going to win. And so it's really helpful to be able to understand sort of what you're up against and what the exposure looks like.
Totally. I was looking for my SBIGG. We have a supplement that binds LPS that I take every day. I was going to, you know, plug that, but I can't find it. I don't know. I want to ask you so many questions. You said we could talk for 6 hours, and you're like not joking, because I could talk to you forever. On the testing topic, though, I do want to talk about plate testing. Yeah. So some companies are still big on that. And I'm just curious, you don't have to give me a long answer, but what is your short, does a short answer exist to that? Like, how do you feel about plate testing?
Like a medium answer. For me, they're completely useless. Here's how they work. You have a plate, right? This little round little canister thing. Mm-hmm. And there's like what looks like a gel substance in it. That's the food source that the mold is supposed to grow on. Okay. So the first thing is, not all mold eats the same food source. So if you don't have the right food source in that plate for the specific mold spore that's falling on, it's not going to grow, but it still is there, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that those only account for what's called like active mold spores, meaning a mold spore is actually able to grow right now. But when I said earlier that most problems in a house are in areas where water damage happened previously and the mold has dried out and it's not active anymore, it's dormant, those spores won't grow on that. They're not able to grow. So it really doesn't give you a good look at really what's going on. Now, on the flip side, the bad thing that it does is, if you're in a house where there's not a problem really, like there's not a whole lot going on, and you happen to get one of the mold spores, which, by the way, everyone, there is spores flying around every house at all times, right? There's never zero. Mm-hmm. If you happen to get one of them that lands on that plate and it happens to be the right food, it is going to grow a lot. And you're going to look at this plate and you're going to be freaked out.
Freaking out, yeah.
Right. So there's just way too many like variables and problems with it for it really to be valuable.
I figured when I said short answer, you were just going to say, move on to the next. So
I'll try that next time. You know, I just feel like context, because like when I listen to shows, it's like, well, they said no, or they said, yeah, but why?
Why? Yep. Yeah. I'm there with you. So can you share with us some signs of hidden mold growth? So obviously I was first prefacing this interview with, I have patients who I feel are moldy, and then I have to convince them to go test their home, right? So the dust test is the best way to do that.
Yep.
But let's say they haven't seen me as a patient. They don't know that I think they're moldy, right? So what are some hidden signs of mold growth in the house? Like, where does mold hide? Where are the top culprits?
Yes. So let's talk about a couple of areas, like where it would happen maybe more frequently. But then the other thing is sort of like how you could even think to identify it. So the places that it's going to happen in terms of source, right? Now again, there's where is it actually growing? That's kind of what we're talking about, right? Now, once something grows, it can spread and move around the house. And at that point, it's not just looking at one thing, right? Like it could be moving through air currents, your air conditioning system could be moving it, it can become contaminated. But let's just talk about like, where's the source problem happening? Where's mold actually growing? It's a big chunk of it is around water because it needs water. So think about your house and where are the places that water happens most
I think
often?
bathroom, kitchen,
Sinks,
or yeah, yeah.
bathrooms, next to showers, toilet areas, by your washing machine, by your dishwasher, by your water heater. Just start naming everything that has a water thing. And those are a lot of areas where you find source issues that happen, right? Now,
And knowing those are the top culprit areas, we've had some issues in the past. So I was like, I'm putting moisture meters everywhere. I bought like 50 of them. I don't know. I don't know if I call it a moisture, not a meter
the water detector,
detector, like a moisture detector. Yeah, not something that, not a humidity gauge, but like a moisture detector. How do you feel about those?
I think they're great for what they are. Now, here's the thing, though, is that a lot of times, and this is, I think, I've said water damage, I said water damage, stuff that grow. When we think water damage, a lot of us think flood, overflow, big thing, water damage. I had this big water damage. Water damage is also, I have my kids in my bath and they splash out of the water. They splash out and it gets on the wall. And I
I've
don't do
heard,
it.
I've listened to one of your episodes on your podcast where you said in my home we have a no splashing rule. Bath time is not as fun or
They know.
something.
They know bath is over. One drop of water comes out of that tub, bath's over, toys go away, we're done. And the reason I tell that story is because a lot of times when we start thinking about these types of things, it's like, how do you stop that? There's no way to stop that. Like, yes, there's a way to, there is. You just have to make an effort, right? But these little things under your sinks, I swear every house we go into, there is literally one sink where there is a mold problem
Sure.
all the time. A little drip, a little teeny tiny drip. It's not, it leaked. It's not, you didn't even know about it. So when you're thinking about like these areas where things can happen, it's not just, did it leak? Did it flood? Did it overflow? It's, is water getting over here, right? Like another, like a sink, when you're washing your hands and you have your towel on a wall rack, you know, like a little ring on your wall and your towel hangs on it. And you go to grab your towel and your hand splashes water on the wall.
Oh, my husband's bad about that.
Hands.
He flicks water everywhere.
Yeah. And you wash your hands multiple times a day and it happens over and over and over. And eventually it starts penetrating in the drywall and you can end up with a problem back there. So these are the areas, just so if you're trying to think where are the areas where it can happen, these are the types of areas that can happen. Now, the things to look for, because everything I just described is not mold growing on walls, right? Most, literally almost every single house I've walked into, I can only think in my mind of two places in the
Thousands,
however 10, 12, 15 years, whatever it's been, where I walked in and there was just stuff on the walls. And I was like, guys, this is, we should just call this one, call it a loss and move on, right? It's only happened literally 2 times. Most times when you walk in, let's use that wall by the tub where, you know, with my kids splashing out. What are you going to see there? You're not going to see mold on the surface, most likely. What you're going to see is what I call one of the 5 signs of hidden mold growth, which is really just a sign of water damage. You're either going to see staining, which is a very easy sign of water damage. You might see bubbling paint or like the baseboard. So if you look at the bottom of a baseboard, it's like bubbling just a little bit. That means moisture is getting there, right? You can literally scan that with your eyes and never see it until you look for it. And then once you look for it, you're like, oh, this is a clue. So guys, the big secret on how we go through houses is we don't look for mold. I mean, if we see it, like that's great, but that's not what we're doing. We're looking for one of these 5 signs of water damage. And then when we see them, we say, we need to test this area to see if there's a hidden mold problem behind here, because that little bubbling in that baseboard is a red flag. It says, hey, moisture may have caused this little damage that the human eye can actually see. Therefore, there's a higher likelihood that there's a mold problem hiding over here. And we test right there, right where the damage is to figure it out, right? And you get as close as you can to it. So staining, bubbling, warping, or bowing or separating. So like, you know, water gets in wood and it kind of like bends, right? So like that sort of concept. That happens a lot in floors, happens in baseboards. You can see it in like under cabinets where like the bottom will be warped. Rust or mineral deposits. So rust happens because of moisture. It's what it is, right? So if you see a nail head somewhere and there's rust on the nail head, it didn't come from nowhere. It came because there was a humidity issue or a moisture issue that caused the corrosion on the nail head,
sure.
which then makes you ask the question, where would that have come from? Mineral deposits, which tie into that. If anyone has a crawl space or a basement, if you've ever gone down and you have like a brick, kind of exposed foundation down there, it's not finished, and you see like that white powdery stuff.
Does concrete count as crawl space?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So if you have concrete, brick, stone, anything like that as like your foundation of the walls, and you see like that white powdery stuff that's sort of on it, that's a mineral deposit from moisture that came through. And that's a sign that there has been a water intrusion at some point in
So
time.
do you need to get rid of that, sweep that up? Is that that's a sign that there was water, you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. So it's a sign that there might be a mold issue over there, and that at minimum it would need to be cleaned, but you would need to be investigating and sort of inspecting around the area. Is there anything else with water damage on it? Is there, has it moved to other areas, like that sort of thing? So those are it. Staining, bubbling, buckling or bowing, mineral deposits, rust, and cracking or peeling, like in paint, like if you see stuff like that. So those are the 5 things. And that's really what you look for. So what you do is you go to where you think the water sources are in your house, and you look for those 5 things. And if you see anything like that, or you're not sure, you're like, I don't know if this is what it is, then the next thing you do, just move your eyes 4 feet to the left and look at the same exact area. Does it look different or does it look the same? So a lot of times, like looking at a baseboard in a bathroom, for example, that same example, there might be a little bubbling on the baseboard right next to the tub. But if I look 4 feet over, the baseboard is smooth and easy, right? It's like, well, why does it look different? It shouldn't look different. It should look the same. It's the same thing. So that inconsistency then becomes like a validating factor in what you're thinking.
Awesome. Those are great tips. Great things for my listeners to look for. But in reality, we're not experts and we could miss a lot of this. So tell me why an inspection is so important.
Well, if we just talked through what needs to be identified to even figure out if there's a problem, and we just kind of said that not everyone's an expert and has the eyes to look through it. It's funny, I was on Dave Asprey's pod a while ago.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. And I explained it, kind of what we just talked through with like testing and signs and this and that. He's like, so it sounds like you're Neo from the Matrix. That's what he said to me. And I was like, well, I do feel like I could walk in and see stuff, but there's something to be said for like an eye that knows how to look for a certain thing, just like a doctor who knows how to analyze something specifically or whatever. So the reason that you need an inspection is that an air test in the middle of the room doesn't tell you anything. So if we know that we're exposed to something or suspect that we're exposed to something, then we really need to dive in and try to figure out where it is. So then we can create a plan on either remediating it or whatever our next step might be, right? And, remediation is kind of a scary thing when you start talking about it, because the first thing people start thinking about is ripping open my entire house and it's going to cost $1 million. And it can in certain cases, right? But I will tell you this, most of our clients don't remediate everything that we find. I think the big thing about this, and before we even get into the specifics, is to set the stage here, it's not about fixing every single thing that we find. It's about finding as much as we can and then prioritizing it and understanding which of those are the biggest contributors to what's going on, and then creating a tiered out plan to address the biggest offenders first, and then the next set of offenders next, if you want to, and the next, if you want to, and you sort of work it down and try to make it more digestible and really apply like the 80-20 concept to it. Because most of our clients get better working with their doctors if you're able to just reduce the really heavy load that they're exposed to a more like, yeah, I'm being exposed, but if I'm also being supported by my
I can handle this. Yes.
And I can handle it and make progress. So it's not like I have to remediate and spend and do everything. We have to know how much there is. We have to know where they all kind of compare to each other in terms of load and concentration and all that stuff. So we could create a plan on how to attack it. And then you attack it in a way that you are able to attack it, right? There's monetary, restrictions. there's logistic restrictions, there's all kinds of things. So then we talk through and we say, okay, well, based on sort of your situation and where you're at, these are the 4 things. Like, do these 4 things. If you could do nothing else, do these 4 things if you can. There might be 7 or 8 other things, but do these 4 and start there. Continue to work with your practitioner and see if you're starting to make progress. And if you're not, you can always do more. You never do less, but you can always do more, right? So there's always more that you can do. So I just kind of like preface it and start there.
So tell us how your company works and that you can even do virtual inspections. Now you even have an app on the phone, like to assist, because you're in California, right? Are you still in California?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah. So our home office is in San Diego. But so when We Inspect started, I worked with Mark in LA, my father-in-law that I mentioned previously, and my partner Corey, who is my cousin-in-law. It's a very fun family dynamic, which I won't bore everybody with the family tree, but we're all related. I married in. He worked with his dad, who is Mark's brother, in New York. We had 2 places. This is all that we did. And we started going to medical conferences and we started learning and meeting people like you and going through all this. And then we started getting asked to speak at the medical conferences because people were like, wow, this is information we need. And as soon as that started happening, we start getting flooded with referrals.
People want your help. Yeah. Yeah.
And we're like, so Corey and I sit down and we're like, well, how do we do this? Like, we can't do this. We got to figure this out. And that's really where We Inspect was created. And the first thing we did was figure out how to basically fly one person all the way around the country, wherever we had people coming in. This is like 4 years ago now. And we found like when a news crew does a remote, they have like a truck outside, right? And the truck has broadcasting equipment that sends it to like the home studio, and the home studio is watching it all, doing whatever. We found that technology that we can fit into a backpack that we put on his name is Joe. He's now our lead of inspection services because he's been with us forever. But at the time, he was, just flying around. And so we put this backpack on him, had 6 different broadcast signals coming out of his backpack, and it was tied to a GoPro. And so I was controlling him in a house like a human controlled robot, because I was seeing it all real time, like in the broadcast studio. I was like, move your hand over here, go here, do this, do that. And that's how it started. And so that was the first phase of us being able to serve everywhere. But as you grow a company, you can't do that over and over again, right? So you got to figure out standards, processes, procedures, ways to maintain quality control, like all this stuff that doesn't require me controlling somebody like a robot. And so, it was a couple of years. It was a lot of investment. It was infrastructure. It was our own internal apps that we were using. So you mentioned the app, which is now public facing, which I'll talk about in a second, but it started as an internal facing app we've been using for 2 years. And then we kind of relayed like a customer overflow on it now that we're able to do some different things with it. But it was really, okay, you're our inspector that's in the field. We know what we need. You're taking photos. They're pushing to us in real time, and we're guiding entire inspections. So the process that we always had, even when it was just before this app even came up publicly, is we do in-person inspections anywhere in the country. It's a team approach. You have someone in the house and you have a lead consultant that is working with them from home office, is guiding them through the house and making sure that we're, dotting all of our T's, checking all of our I's, and strategy is in place, and we're understanding all the things, and we're not missing anything, right? So that was kind of the original build. And, and then 2 years ago at our annual meeting, rolled out this concept that we call PAC. And basically what I was saying when I was explaining this to the company was there's only 3 reasons that somebody wouldn't work with us. The first reason is price, because it's too expensive for them to fly someone across the country and come to their house, right? So we have to start thinking about ways that we can fix this or provide alternatives to this.
Sure.
The second was access. So access, meaning I live in Iowa, how do I get you to come here, right? So now we have built out the first way to be there in person, but there's still limitations to that. There's timing, there's scheduling, there's a lot of things. So the access, while it was there, it wasn't like floodgate open, right? So like there were still some barriers on access. And then the third reason is knowledge. And it's really the core reason. If somebody doesn't know enough, and they're not going to know that they need to do this stuff in a certain way. So we call that the PAC, and everything that we do now, We Inspect, in terms of initiatives and offerings and products, has to fill this pack. And if it doesn't check these things, then it doesn't make sense. And it's not something that we move forward with. And so what we have been working on for the last year and a half is what we call We Inspect Together, which is now the sort of consumer-facing version of what was our internal app previously. And so the way that it works is, you're actually able as a consumer, you could go to weinspect.com or weinspect.com/together, and there's a page there, and there's different plans that you can get for the app, and you literally can inspect one room if you want to. So the accessibility and the barriers of like, if we're going to come here, we have to look at the whole house, we have to do this. But what if I'm just concerned because my daughter's room, there was a window leak and I just want to make sure the window is okay. A year ago, we weren't able to help that person, and I wasn't okay with that. And so it's like, how do we fix this? How do we maintain our same quality of what we do, but we're able to open it up? And so that's really what the app is. The app, I kind of describe it as an app-powered inspection companion, right? So it's essentially a window for us to look into your house. Instead of us having our inspector there, this app is the window that we have into your house now. Now, the difference is that we don't have to train you as homeowner or renter or occupant where to point it, because in the app, it tells you exactly where to point it. It says, you have a window, and you do an on, there's a thing. It says, hey, what room do you want to look at? This bedroom. Do you have a window? Yes. Cool. All right, we know that. Do you have this? Yeah, cool. We know that. And it says, okay, for this window, I need to see these 4 pictures. And it shows you an example of the picture and the angle that we need. Take these 4 pictures. Shoots back to us, and now we can look at them and know exactly what we're looking for, which is everything we talked about before, the 5 signs and all these things, and say, okay, we think that there's an issue here. This is how we would test it. We're going to recommend a test here in this way. And it all gets reviewed on a follow-up call to walk through, what we found, what the plan looks like, and how it all works. So like for anyone who's ever used a car insurance app, or like maybe getting a fender bender, and they're like, oh, take these 3 pictures of your bumper, and then we're going to tell you how we've assessed it and where to go to get it fixed. That's what We Inspect Together is. That's what the app is.
That's very smart. That's excellent.
So yeah, I'm so pumped about it. We don't know when this airs, but we just formally launched like the consumer version of it, where it's actually out there the 2nd week in November. So I'm really pumped. It's going very well. And what's even more exciting is that we can actually apply our methods and our process, which just doesnn't really exist in other places. Yeah, I joked around about this. I was speaking at a different summit the other day, or the other week, and I was in a Q&A. I'm like, guys, it's 2024 almost. We have AI, we have machine learning, we have algorithms. Yet if I have, and I literally said Iowa, so I kind of started laughing at the beginning when you said I'm in Iowa. It's like, why is everything coming back to Iowa right now? I was like, if I live in the middle of Iowa in a town that has, 5,000 or 10,000 people or whatever it is, I should not be limited to Yelp in Iowa to find the service that I need, when I can literally get the top level service that exists while I'm still here. Like, location is no longer a problem, and it isn't for anything really. So it doesn't need to be for this either, Like if my kid was sick and with some sort of specific disease, I would go find the best doctor that does that. And so now this allows somebody to do that same thing. And that's why I'm really excited about how it's going to change a lot of how the industry works and how people are able to get things handled.
No, that is exciting. And you have different levels of inspection, like assistance that you can provide, and all that's on your site. And that's excellent. With our few last minutes here, I do want to ask a couple more questions. I'm going to skip over remediation just because I'm going to have some other remediators on the show later this season. But we talked about, mold and fragments in the air. And so I know my listeners are going to, if I don't ask this, going to wonder why I didn't ask about air filtration. So how important is air filtration? Do you have favorite companies? I mean, we have air doctors going in our clinic because that's, years ago when I heard about air filtration, that's just what I bought at that time. But what are your thoughts?
I think it's incredibly important. I think it's important beyond mold. There's a lot of other stuff floating around in the air. The first thing I think about is water filtration. Would you drink water out of your sink tap?
I wouldn't. Heck no. Yep.
Hell no. Like, you wouldn't, especially, no, like some people in New York are like, we have clean water. You know what? Open up one of your pipes and tell me your water is clean. But no, like, it's not even an option. It's like it wouldn't even happen. And then bottled water became a thing, and all this stuff became a thing because of this core understanding that it makes literally no sense to be drinking something that's running through a line that's been around for 100 years that has all kinds of stuff in it, right? Like, of course. Well, when you think about our houses and you think about what's going on behind the walls, it's not a lot different than those pipes that have been corroded with a bunch of junk that's built up in them. You have a house that's even 5 years old, but most homes are older than that, 10, 15, 20, 30 years old. You know, a lot of people have never opened a wall to see what's back there. But guys, it's freaking gross what's behind all of these walls, okay? And it's not just mold, it's insects that are back there. It's mice that have figured out how to get back there and poop and crap behind all your walls. It's disgusting. And our air moves through all of those walls all the time, and it becomes our breathable air. So mold aside, I have an air filter in pretty much every single room in my house now. It started in bedrooms because not everyone can do that. Like I've been accumulating them over time. But you think of like, where do I need them the most? You need them where you spend the most time, where you breathe the most, right? So your bedroom's the first place. So you stick them in your bedroom first. If you have kids, put them in their bedrooms, right? Like that's where they need them. Next, most homes have some sort of general congregating open concept kitchen living space thing. That's the next place because that's generally where we spend the next most amount of time. Get one in there. And then after that, if you have ancillary places, you could choose to put them or not put them. You don't have to cover every square foot of your house with them. You just want to cover like where you spend 70, 80% of your time in your house. You want to cover with them. So 100% full on believer, you need to have them. Everyone should have them. Now let's start talking about what they are and which ones you use and like what you're looking for. If we're looking under the lens of this conversation, we're talking about mold fragmentation and kind of what we're talking about here. So the fragments are incredibly small, like we talked about earlier. So a lot of us have heard of HEPA. HEPA is 0.3 microns. That's the size of HEPA. So just to kind of throw the number out there, right?
Yep.
When we're talking about fragments, the size of fragments, we're talking about stuff that's down to like 0.007 in size compared to 0.3. That's like the equivalent of like beach ball to golf ball. Like that's the size equivalent. And so when you're looking for these filters, it can't just be a HEPA filter. Like you're not going to get these tiny particles. It's just going to suck them in and spit them right back out and make them airborne again, right? So we need to be getting a filter that can actually filter down that small. So there's a couple of them out there that do filter down that small. IQ Air filters down that small. IntelliPure filters down that small. AirOasis has a unit called iAdapt Air that filters down to that level. And I'm pretty sure the Air Doctor filters down that small as well, or just maybe a hair bigger, but still very small in comparison to HEPA. I'm pretty sure.
Those are all the brands that I recommend. And then Austin Air is also on my list. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's the same thing, right? Like, so what I'm looking for when I'm looking at one, I'm not looking necessarily for the fancy, like it does PCO and it magically destroys this and it does this. My philosophy on stuff has originated from this career and has turned into life is I don't want to let the problem in and then try to handle it. I want to stop the problem from coming in the first place, right? Like if I opened my door, when I opened my door, some guy was standing there and he always punched me in the face. My goal would not be to try to find some other way to get into my house or try to like, once I get in, how do I stab him or get rid of, my goal would just be, how do I get this guy out of my house? So when I open my door, he's not there and I'm not trying to dodge him and do all this stuff, right? So when I'm thinking of what we're breathing, what's going on, I want to filter before anything. I want to filter before I'm sanitizing and killing and PCOing and ozoning. I want to filter first. If I could stop it from coming in the first place, then I don't have to worry about it on the back end. And so that's my sort of philosophy on it.
Well, excellent. The molecule is all over Instagram and I haven't taken enough time to actually look at that. Does that filter down small enough or is that more of just a marketing, probably not good enough scheme?
So they actually haven't published how low they filter. I've looked into getting them a couple times and maybe they've changed.
Yeah.
But the particle size like number has never really been published that I've seen.
It's good to
know. So
their
thing is stuff comes in and it has a process that kills and you know denatures stuff and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of people that love molecules and say they work for them. but I never pulled the trigger on one because I just didn't know, like, well, what's it filtering? Like, because that's just my
Yeah, I
thought
want to
process.
know if I'm going to spend the money. I want to know.
Yeah.
I have to come back to fogging on the air topic, though. Are you a fan of fogging? Is that something that
This is a really good question. And when you asked it earlier, it's like, well, what do we do with the fragments? Is this where fogging comes in?
Yeah.
Okay. There are two reasons that people fog. One of them is the right reason. One of them is the wrong reason. The wrong reason is a remediator comes in and says, we're going to fog your house and everything's going to be fixed. It's magic.
Without remediating? Like without,
yeah, they do this all the time. They do this all the time. Or they'll say, we're just going to rip out maybe this wall, but then we're going to fog everything and everything's going to be fixed. So here's the issue. We talked earlier about how mold doesn't have to be alive and active right now to still release the fragments that we breathe to cause problems. Fogging, at its best, the best it can do is kill stuff. It is not magically making it disappear into nothingness.
Right, right.
And so what we're doing is like, cool, kill the mold. That's awesome. It means nothing because I'm still going to breathe it. Right? It's like if I killed an animal and stuck it under the house in the crawl space, I'm still going to smell it in the house, right? Like it might be dead under there, but I'm still going to smell it. It's going to make its way up. The same thing is going to happen if you just kill mold with a fog. So if the purpose of the fog is I'm just going to come in and kill everything, and that's my purpose of the fog, it does not work. I've seen it not work. You're going to get charged like 10 grand to do it. And then you're going to feel better for a month. Anyone who's listening to this done this, I'm going to tell you exactly what what happened to you. You paid 8 to 10 grand. You felt better for 1 to 2 months, and then your symptoms started coming back. Why did they start coming back? Because what the fog did is it killed stuff and it brought it all down, so it wasn't in your breathing zone. And then over time, your air currents started pushing everything up again. You started breathing again, and all your symptoms came back because they didn't actually remove the source of the problem, right? So that's the bad fogging. Like if that's why you're doing it, you don't do it that way. Now, fogging does play a really important role in remediation. In phase 2 of remediation. So remediation is 2 phases. The first phase is to remove the source of the growth. I say this analogy of like knocking the factory down, getting the factory out of there. So if you imagine a factory, it's a structure and smoke is coming out of the top, and that causes the air pollution that we breathe. While the air pollution is a problem, it's not the root problem. The root problem is the factory that was pumping the smoke out in the first place. So if our goal is to be able to walk outside and breathe fresh, clean air, we have to do 2 things, not 1. First, we have to knock the factory down so it stops creating smoke. Second, we have to clean up all the smoke that already got created. Those are the 2 things we have to do. That exact concept happens in a house. First, you have to find where the sources of the mold are, which is how we talked about going through a house, inspecting, testing a wall, this, that, or whatever. You have to remediate that, which might mean remove the wall, treat and handle the framing that exists back there, get rid of the debris, like remediate properly, which, you said you have someone coming, so I won't go into it.
Well, not just to save your time, but yeah, that's a whole nother topic. Yeah.
So that's phase 1. Phase 1 is now I've removed the sources. There's no more factory that's going to create more smoke. Phase 2 is now we have a bunch of smoke floating in our house. We have to get rid of the smoke. The smoke is the equivalent to the fragments that we were talking about earlier. This is where fogging comes in. Now, the purpose of the fog here is not to kill anything. You could fog with water droplets for all I care. I literally don't care what you're fogging with. The purpose of the fog...
I almost want to interrupt you there, though, because I do want to do some fogging, but I don't want to use chemicals. I want to use something more natural. Just because I feel like, why would I put more chemicals, especially into a clinic when patients have chemical sensitivity? Like the chemicals don't make sense to me.
100%.
Jill Carnahan recommends BioBalance, which is more botanical based. Yep. I don't know, but sorry, interrupting you. But so I feel like it does matter, but to get to your point, continue.
Well, for the purpose of what I'm saying, it's not that we're using it to achieve anything other than one goal. The goal that I'm using it for, because if you think about stuff floating in a house, how am I possibly going to float or clean stuff that's floating in a house when it's constantly being resuspended and popped up all over the place? I have to get it somewhere where it's collected in one spot, where then I can clean it and remove it. So
fogging with small particle cleaning, you're saying?
Yep. So fogging will add weight to the particles that are floating around because the water droplets or the mist droplets will hit them. It'll add weight. Gravity will bring them down. Everything is now brought down to surface. And now we're wiping. We're wiping all the particle away. So
with what? With
microfiber towels.
Okay.
Yeah. And you're just trying to wipe it down.
And then vacuum?
So at that point, you know, some remediators just say they want that you want to finish with a vacuum, some won't. If you vacuum, you're popping stuff up in the air. So then you start creating this like constant loop of like, well, then do I need to fog again? And then I went, well, but if I vacuum, then it's up in the air. Then do I need to fog again? Like, where do I stop? Right.
Yeah,
I
that's
had this
tough.
big old argument with a remediator one day about like, he's like, you have to vacuum after. I was like, but then like it's up in the air again. So like, do you fog?
That's tough.
You can pick wherever you want to. The way that we write our protocols, you vacuum first to get any of the big dust clumps that have built up in places, get rid of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you fog, and then you wipe, and then you don't finish with another vacuum. We just end on the wipe, right? So
Sure.
it's a multi wipe. So that's how you get rid of the fragment, and that's how you get
And
rid
do
of
you
the fact
fog your
that,
vents? Do you fog your HVAC?
well, so the HVAC isn't necessarily a fogging, right? It's a question of, is it contaminated? If so, how bad is it? And then your solution is either replacement or cleaning, right? So again, fogging, if you fog an HVAC, and you're not actually trying to clean anything, all you're doing is getting stuff down onto the surfaces in there, and then you're going to have air that blows by it super hard anyway, and it's going to come right back out. So fogging isn't going to do anything.
What if you
So
fog right before you clean your ducts?
well, when you clean your ducts, the way that they're cleaned is that like a brush goes into them basically, and it spins around really fast. And so even if you fogged, the way that you actually clean ducts is stuff not to be settled. You actually want to unsettle it, and then they put like a vacuum on the other end of the duct line, and they're sucking it all out, right? That's how they clean ducts traditionally.
So maybe you
So
don't
you would
really need to
actually,
fog your ducts, though. Maybe you just need to get your ducts
I
clean.
don't think that you need to. I'm
Like,
very,
it
very,
depends on how bad the situation is, though, I'm sure.
I'm very against introducing, like you said, any sort of product into my heating and air conditioning system that's going to get blown out at me every time it turns on, right? Like I've known people that have fogged this, and then all of a sudden it's like there's this smell that's coming out forever, and like the components of the fog keeps coming out. So I don't fog. I don't like fogging HVACs. They can be cleaned if they need to, or they can be replaced, but those are kind of the two options.
Awesome. That was so much. You answered so many questions, so thank you. I have one last really quick question is you had mentioned on one of your episodes that you have rubber mats under each of your sinks in case
Yeah.
there are any water leaks. Where do you get those? Like what
Uh,
kind of
weathertech.com.
Oh, same thing we
TECH.
have in our car. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like primarily a car company.
Which
And
those things will off gas. So first you gotta air them out before you bring them in your home, but that's wise to put under any area that could, yeah, you could have a water leak near.
every sink in your house should have one of these under it. Every sink in my house has one. They're not expensive in the grand scheme of things. They basically can hold a gallon of water. So if you have like a leak that's dripping for a period of time that you don't know about, it can hold it before it gets to your cabinetry, before it gets to your walls. So it's preventing the water from getting there. Huge, huge, huge.
That's a great
proponent of
tip. I
having stuff.
took my son to get my car cleaned, an SUV cleaned, and then we went and got him a chocolate peanut butter smoothie. And about 2 minutes after we started driving away, he said, "Mommy, you're gonna have to get your car cleaned again because you dropped the smoothie all over there." But I had one of those WeatherTech mats, in the back seat. So honestly, all the chocolate was contained. There's no mold in my car. Got the mats
Yep.
cleaned. So that was a savior for me. Oh boy.
Nice.
Well, tell us where listeners can find you. If you have any last tips, tell us about your podcast, and we'll wrap up the show here.
Yeah. So my podcast is called Mold Finders Radio. So I talk like this all the time. I ramble on. So if you like this, you'll like that. The where you can reach us. So if you actually want to like speak with us, we do free phone consults for people, just to see like, if someone's interested in actually figuring out if they have something going on in their house, we want to help you figure that out, right? So our site is yesweinspect.com. There's a big yellow button at the top. You can do that. There's a few questions to fill out, so we kind of know sort of where you fit in the grand scheme of things, and then we can, schedule a call with you, right? So that's sort of where you go if you feel like you want to talk to us. Otherwise, on social media, on Instagram, I'm at Mold Finders, and there's a lot going on there. There's so much free information that I try to put out because I want people to be educated. So between the podcast is like 200 hours. I mean, you do it too. You have so many hours, right? There's like 200 plus hours or something on mine right now or whatever. Plus, social platforms. There's so many places to dive in and really get it. And if you ever feel like you're like, you know what, I think now it's time to talk then set a call and talk to us.
And I will say the dust test link again, of which we'll post in the show notes. That's also on our clinic website. If any of our patients are just like already in, I want to do the test, we have the link for you. But also that company in general has tons of resources that I've only recently found out about. So I look forward to sharing those resources with our patients as well. So I keep saying last question, but really last question. I end every show asking my listener their top longevity tip. So what would your top longevity tip be?
I'm so into this right now. It's so funny. I'll tell you everything I just did today. I woke up and I worked out at 5:30. I then got in a sauna for 20 minutes and sweated it out afterwards. Then I came upstairs, did my work, did everything. Midday, I am sitting on a PEMF mat. I do PEMF for 20 to 30 minutes. Then I do Wim Hof breath work. And then I go infrared, or then I go red light in my garage. I have a red light machine. And then I cold plunge after that.
When do you go to the bathroom? No, I'm just
I am
kidding you.
so all in. I know it's actually, I've structured my day where I can really make it work. But the reason I actually say all that, because I was thinking about this earlier, it's like, God, so much stuff. And it used to be like overwhelming because I wanted to do every single one of them. But because I didn't have a plan on how to do it, it never happened. And then when I sat down, I was like, here's sort of how I'm time blocking my day in a way. Then it's very easy to do it because it fits in the flow and everything builds around it. So I think what I would say for my tip, outside of which thing you should be doing and all of this stuff, because there's benefits to all of it, I think what we need to do generally is figure out how to break down whatever barriers we have up to pursue the things that we think will help our longevity. And for some people, that's, I can't work out because my kids are here and this or that. Well, when can you? Is there a time that you can? Like, how do we structure that to make it easier for you? So I think for longevity, the only way it works is if we're able to do it. And the only way we're able to do something is if we remove barriers and make it easy for ourselves to do it. And so I worked a lot on that in the last couple of months for myself personally, which is how I could just describe. I did 8 different things today for my health that were outside of work and recording and all of this stuff. So I encourage people, if you're really in the longevity flow and you're diving into all of the things you can do, and sometimes it feels overwhelming because it's so much and you want to do so many things, figure out how you start. Figure out how you remove a barrier to do it. You can always add on a little bit then once you build a habit out of it and you do that. And that's how you get longevity, is by doing the things as a habit on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great answer. That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing about the dust test, but also just sharing there's hope for patients who I think previously, again, maybe didn't have access or were discouraged or just didn't know how to find inspectors and whatnot. Just sharing that your company has tons of resources, different materials to help individuals struggling in this department really clean up their environment and really save their health. So this was great. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.